Thank you very much, Julian. I appreciate the introduction. And I'm very pleased to be here tonight to talk a little bit about the context of this Pennsylvania Declaration, because it really is a landmark change in the way we approach and think about museums, and we think specifically about the acquisitions of antiquities within museums. So let me give you a little bit of context in terms of what we're really talking about. We're talking about the destruction of heritage around the world. Here are two photographs that show you Iraq and Peru, two very different places, but a desert environment that allow us to show you the destruction. And what you can see here is the excavations by an archaeologist in the central part, and every one of these little divots out here is a large illegal excavation where people were going out looking for objects to collect and then to sell and put on the market. Here is a modern-day cemetery in Peru, and again, you can see this, and in both of these slides, you can see that this goes way off into the distance. This is the ongoing destruction that we begin to see in these two places where we can see aerial photographs. In Guatemala, in places where I work in the rainforest, aerial photographs don't show you that. We can't see through the canopy. But if you see here is a small pyramid in Guatemala, and this is, in fact, a very recent excavation, illegal excavation, and you can see the white stones that have been pulled out, the limestone. This is an illegal excavation that has gone in specifically looking for a tomb or some sort of a cache of objects, again, to rip that out and to then try to sell it on the market. Oftentimes, when we come across this, we will find bone, we will find other objects out here that the looters have thrown away. And just to give you a sense, this is not something that is very distant. I have come across people who are excavating illegally. I have been shot at by looters. This is actually an ongoing problem in Latin America and in many respects around the world. Now, in 1970, what we're talking about is the Philadelphia Declaration. I'm not going to read it all for you, but I do want to read just a couple of short things at this point and then move on and read you one other part later on. But it begins. The curatorial faculty of the University Museum today reached the unanimous conclusion that they would purchase no more art objects or antiquities for the museum unless the objects are accompanied by a pedigree. That is, information about the different owners of the objects, place of origin, legality of export, and other data useful in each individual case. The information will be made public. That's a very critical point. This decision was recommended by the director of the museum, Froelich Rainey, and also by the chairman of the board of managers, Howard C. Peterson. So this is April 1st, 1970. What I'd like to do is to create really three contexts for you. What was going on before the Declaration, a little bit about the Declaration, and then what's happened since the Declaration. And when we begin to look at what was going on before the Declaration, if we go back into the 1940s and 1930s, people were worried about the destruction of heritage. But there was a period of time when people really weren't worried about that, and museums were acquiring objects. And in 1969, in the Art Journal, Clemency C. Coggins, at that time a graduate student at Harvard, began to document the destruction of heritage in the Maya area, the movement of material from the jungles of Guatemala and Mesoamerica, specifically up into museums in the United States. And the museums that she pointed a finger at, who were buying these objects, were museums in Cleveland, Houston, Minneapolis, Brooklyn, St. Louis, and then private dealers in other European museums. This was not just a couple of little museums off in the corner. These were major central museums that were buying major portions of illegal objects that had been ripped out of the jungle, and Clemency Coggins was one of the first people to identify that and bring that to the attention of the general public and the professional public. At the same time, in 1968, in 1970 to 71, the Metropolitan Museum put on this exhibit called Before Cortez, Sculpture of Middle America. This is the front of the museum, and this is the book that came out, a very influential book, very important book. But as it turns out, in 1968, this object showed up at the Metropolitan Museum. And I don't mean an object. This is the entire side of a Maya pyramid in the area of Campeche. An entire side of a Maya pyramid was cut away from that pyramid, put into crates, shipped up to the Metropolitan Museum for that exhibit. They sat on it for about 6 months thinking about buying it. The price was about $500,000 to $600,000, which at that time was quite a bit of money. As it turns out, the Metropolitan Museum on December 1968 said no thank you. And eventually they called the Mexican government in, who reclaimed it, and it is now, and here you can see it, in the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. But just to give you a sense, we're not talking about just a pot or a small piece of jade or something. We're talking about entire sides of Maya pyramids being cut away and shipped up into the United States. We're not all just talking about antiquities. As it turns out, we're also talking about other pieces of fine arts. And in fact, here we have, and I apologize for the poor quality of the photograph, but in fact, Perry Rathbone from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in 1968 again purchased in Italy a painting that was attributed to Raphael. He spirited it out of the country, no export permit, not allowed by the government of Italy, but he took it out of the country. They unveiled it in Boston, and then Italy came along and said, what are you doing? And eventually it did get taken back to Italy, and eventually it turns out that the painting was not by Raphael. It's no longer been attributed to Raphael. But this gives you a sense that by 1971, it was shipped back. This is, again, the type of thing that was going on in these late 1960s, early 1970s. And then Brian Rose will talk about this much more, but in 1966, the Penn Museum acquired some gold that may have been from Troy, and George Bass on the left there began the exploration of what was this gold, where did it come from, and wrote an article in the Penn Museum's magazine, journal, Expedition, and began to question, where did it come from? What do we know about this? And I know Brian will explore that in just a few minutes. So this is what was going on before, and I'm just giving you a couple of examples, but a huge amount of material being ripped out of the ground and moving around. The declaration itself. Here are the two main players. Fro Rainey, who was director from 1947 to 1976. He was an archaeologist who had worked up in the northwestern part of the Americas, had focused on arrival of humans into the New World, but was a director for a long number of years. And Howard C. Peterson, and Julian just giving you a little background on Mr. Peterson, but chair of the board from 1963 to 1980. And these were the two people really who focused upon this. And I think really Fro Rainey became very focused on trying to think about how the Penn Museum could be part of a very large international conversation that was beginning to take place in 1969 and in 1970. And in fact, going back into the correspondence, it's interesting. We don't find a lot of information, a lot of communication between Fro Rainey and the curators about this issue. It's just not in the files. But what I did begin to find was that before April 1st, 1970, it was clear that there were conversations, international conversations, taking place in Paris and Brussels and other places about a UNESCO convention, trying to bring countries and museums together to think about how to stop this illegal movement of materials. And I'll talk about this convention in just a second. The name of this convention, and I always need a crib sheet on this, and I apologize, because it's not one of the great names of the world. This convention is called the Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, Export, and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property. So this was an attempt, again, to stop that movement, but again, it's a little later in 1970. I think actually what was interesting is that Fro Rainey, earlier in 1970 and in 1969, actually begins to complain in some correspondence. What he says is, you guys are not including the university museums. You're including the same museums that we're having trouble with that cannot and should not represent the museum world. He mentions Cleveland Museum of Art, he mentions the Metropolitan Museum, and he mentions the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And he says basically, why aren't you including the rest of us? And I think one of the ways that he has decided to move forward on this, not only does he realize that there's a problem with illicit antiquities, but there's also this problem of not including the Penn Museum and other university museums. And I think what happens on April is what he basically says is the only way we're going to become part of this conversation is to jump into the middle of it. And that's what he does on April 1st with this declaration. And I'd like to read you just a couple of other pieces, which I think are very important. The action of the University Museum staff is the result of an increasing illicit trade in cultural objects, particularly antiquities, which is causing major destruction of archaeological sites in many countries throughout the world. In another paragraph, it is the considered opinion of the University Museum group of archaeologists and anthropologists who work in many countries throughout the world that import controls in the importing countries will be no more effective than the export controls in the exporting countries. Probably the only effective way to stop this wholesale destruction of archaeological sites is to regulate the trade in cultural objects within each country, just as most countries in the world today regulate domestic trade in foodstuffs, drugs, securities, and other commodities. The looting of sites is naturally done by the nationals of each country, and the illicit trade is carried out by them and by the nationals of many countries. Hence, the preservation of the cultural heritage for mankind as a whole is, in fact, a domestic problem for all nations. So, what they do very quickly on April 1st, 1970 is jump into that discussion and make sure that the Penn Museum is there first, which is very exciting for us today, but also, in many respects, to make sure that the university and the research establishment is part of that conversation. It's not just the collecting museums. And what they clearly understood at that time, and I think we continue to have to relearn this process, is what is, in fact, the process of destruction. The process of destruction does start out in the field where people are excavating, but again, it's local communities who are doing this, who need the resources. They oftentimes are selling it to national agents or traders who are selling it to other middlemen, international dealers, who are passing it through auction houses, who are eventually selling it to private collectors and museums. And the critical point here is, in fact, that looting is economically driven by collectors, auction houses, museums, middlemen, organized crime, and regional poverty. So what we need to do as we think about this is not just to say we have to stop this, but to think about what are the causes of it. Some of the causes are the market, but some of the causes are also the issues of poverty around the world. So the question is, what has happened since this declaration? What has happened over the past 40 plus years? And in fact, we've just passed the 40th anniversary. First of all, there are a variety of laws, of different approaches. The UNESCO 1970 Convention that I mentioned, which has become the line about acquisitions that I'll talk about in just a second. In 1983, the U.S. implemented this 1970 Convention with its own law, which is required under the U.S. law, and it's called the Convention on Cultural Property Implementation Act. Another law, 1990, the NAGPRA, which is Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. We've also brought about the National Stolen Property Act, and internationally there are national ownership laws in many of the various countries. So since then, we have gotten a variety of other legal mechanisms to stop looting. But, and it's a big but here, I'm not sure we've made much progress. Here are just a few of the objects that have been questioned about where they belong, where are they today, whether it's Nefertiti in Berlin, and I'm not going to get into whether it should or shouldn't go back. This is simply, it's been raised as a question, or the Getty bronze, or an object from the Iraq National Museum, or obviously the Parthenon marbles, a Maya vase at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And on the bottom left is, in fact, a golden Egyptian mask that was bought by the St. Louis Art Museum. It had been excavated in 1952 in Egypt. It was clearly stolen at some point, put on the market. They bought it for $500,000, and they won't give it back. So this is an ongoing issue. Now, what's interesting is that one of the big breakthroughs in all of this occurred in the mid and early 1990s. And this is, in fact, when an individual, one of the major looters, or a middleman, in fact, in Italy, Giacomo de' Medici, when his warehouse was raided by Swiss police accompanied by the Carabinieri. And this was on September 13th, 1995. And they entered what were, in fact, 4 warehouses. And in these 4 warehouses, they had upwards of 10,000 pieces of antiquity from around the world, worth upwards at that time of $35 million. 10,000. Think about the quantity of material that it was was moving around at that time and at other times. And this is just one individual, and his operation in Italy doesn't include anything in any other parts of the world. What we begin to see with Giacomo de' Medici, and there he is in the middle, standing next to the Euphroneous crater that I'll mention in just a second. He was selling through his network objects to all of these museums and many others. But this is just what was going on since 1970 again. This is one of the great examples that many of you have heard of, and it is Giacomo de' Medici, who starts out with the Euphroneous crater, one of the great dealers, and I say that facetiously, Robert Hecht, who sold it for $1 million to the Metropolitan Museum, and Thomas Hoving, and eventually Philippe de Montebello was director, and under great pressure, finally returned it in 2006 to Italy. But again, it wasn't an easy return. It was pushed. They had to shove. It moved forward very slowly. And I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but just to give you some sense of the fact that in 1997, this individual who spirited this bust out of Egypt, looking like this looked like a trinket that you could buy by the pyramids. That's what it really was. They were trying to sell it for $1 million. Eventually, he was convicted in England, and then Frederick Schultz, top left corner there, one of the dealers on Madison Avenue, was convicted and sent to jail for 3 years. One of the first times that we were able to convict somebody based on antiquity schemes. But it has happened very rarely. And in fact, museums around the country have had to return objects, whether that's Princeton, whether it's Cleveland, and whether it's the Toledo Museum of Art. And I was just in Toledo giving a slightly different talk, but about some of these issues and talking to them about the problems. Now the question is, why after 1970, where you have the Pennsylvania Declaration, you have the UNESCO convention, that more or less says museums shouldn't be purchasing these things without provenance, without clear indication of where the objects come from, with an export permit and an import permit and so on. Why are museums continuing to collect? And it's a question that baffles me sometimes. But let's listen to two museum directors. One will be Philippe de Montebello, and then the second video will be James Cuno, who was the director of the Art Institute in Chicago and is now the president and CEO of the J. Paul Getty Trust.
Acquisitions define the institution. If you do not acquire, works of art do not enter the building, it's empty and it's not a museum. So the acquisitions process is at the very heart of an art museum. Antiquities, the ancient world, represents approximately 2/3 of the modern history, 3,000 years, 3 millennia before the birth of Christ, and 2 afterwards. So you're talking about 3,000 years of recorded history with great works of art from Egypt, from Mesopotamia, from Greece, from Rome, and elsewhere. And they deserve their place as the ancestors of all of the modern world.
So that's his justification for what he wants to buy and why he wants to buy it. What I'd like to do is turn to James Cuno to give you and this is a video, that was 2006. This is a video of 2 months ago. And he's talking about, again, encyclopedic museums, why they're important and why they must acquire.
The ambition of the Encyclopedic Museum at its founding was to bring into one house representative examples of all the world's culture in order to promote understanding and curiosity about the world and difference in the world. And I think in today's environment, given the polyglot, multi-ethnic world in which we live, in which the world is also intertwined and interdependent, it's even more the case that we need to provide a space where people can be curious about difference in the world, can come to understand difference in the world and appreciate it. So I think probably it's more valuable now than even in the 18th century.
And I think in many respects the issue is it is about having objects and controlling objects which allow, in some sense, museums to control the story of the past. We have to think it's not just about objects we're talking about, it's about telling stories. Because that's what we do as archaeologists, that's what we do as historians and classicists and so on. We tell a story, and it's controlling that story. So part of this story then is today, I think, if we think about what's continued on here at the museum, I think first of all I just wanted to mention that at the 40th anniversary there was an article about the Pennsylvania Declaration by Alex Pizzotti from the archives here at the museum, an expedition acknowledging that. Brian Rose has been doing a variety of training of U.S. troops before they went over to Iraq or Afghanistan to give them some sense of what type of cultural background exists in these areas. And one of the things that we have done here at the museum that I'm extremely proud of is the Penn Cultural Heritage Center, where what we have done is trying to bring a lot of these cultural and heritage issues together in one place here at the museum. We have a variety of field projects, whether it's in California working with Native Americans, or working on landscape preservation in Turkey, or on heritage issues in Mexico. We're also, in fact, I'm off tomorrow to Washington to talk about a museum project where we're trying to help build 5 museums in Latin America, to think about the preservation of artifacts and also how museums connect into communities. And that's a theme I'll come back to in just a second. We have also done a variety of training of Homeland Security, just off the screen there, but we have trained Homeland Security both here at the museum over 2 or 3 day courses, and we had about 10 or 12 of these courses, as well as going out to the ports of entry. So when you come back from a foreign land, and you land at the Philadelphia airport or the Washington airport or the LA airport, and the people who are checking your bags, some of them were trained here. Not to know what an antiquity is, but to think about the issues of antiquities, and potentially to pull them aside, to detain them, to ask and to call us, to give them help on identifying whether the object is real or not, and then they have to decide whether in fact it was legally brought back into this country. We've had a variety of conferences on heritage issues, individual views of heritage, underwater cultural heritage that we're still working on in many respects. And I just want to give you a sense that this is an ongoing issue. Because this is, in fact, the headline that's going to be in the art newspaper for the next month. And this was a conversation, an op-ed that I wrote with 2 of my colleagues, Brian Daniels and Christina Luke, but it is in opposition to a museum person, Arthur Houghton, who is arguing, in fact, that museums should be able to continue to acquire antiquities. So this is not a past conversation. The Declaration didn't finish this. It's an ongoing issue. And I just want to close up by talking just for a moment about museums and their role in our society. Because here we have just Boston, LA, the Philadelphia Museum of Art. These are great institutions in our cities. But in many respects, they must represent the communities within which they live. They must represent them in terms of understanding our communities, understanding who they represent, and why they represent us. And to a large degree, I would argue that with my name in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, or when I lived in Los Angeles, or when I lived in Boston, I want those museums to represent me. And if they are buying antiquities, let me rephrase that. If they are buying illegal antiquities, which is what they are doing, they are not representing me well, they are not representing you well, they are not representing our communities. And so I argue both in that art newspaper, Peace, as well as in other places, that museums must be community institutions and they must be moral institutions. And in so doing, I think we can move forward to not think about how they have to acquire objects, but to think much more about how they can borrow objects from great museums around the world, whether that's in Egypt, whether that's in Mexico, or whether that's in New York or Boston, and they can put on wonderful exhibits. But they don't need to buy illegal antiquities. Thank you very much. And now let me turn the podium over to Brian Rose, and I'll let you, could you get that off of me?
Okay, thank you, Richard. And I do, as we take a minute to get the next PowerPoint up, which is already up, thank you, Jerry, want to signal how important Richard's Cultural Heritage Center has been to the museum and to the discussion of antiquities collection throughout the U.S. and throughout the world. There were times when we were training the Homeland Security agents, and I remember the first time I did it, I was talking about the importance of archaeological context. How if you don't have obviously if you don't have the antiquity, if you don't know the provenance, the context in which the antiquity was found, it's difficult to know or to be able to say in a publication who made it, why they made it, how it was made, functioned in the society. Upside down. How about that? Better. Okay, how it functioned in the society that produced it. And some of them said to me, well, what is context? Right at the beginning of the discussion, I was just assuming they knew what context was and why it was important and why their work at the borders was so critical to antiquities protection. They had no idea. And it was the same when I was training the soldiers who were deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan. They just had no idea about this. So we need more centers such as the one Richard has created to spread the gospel, in a sense, of the issues involving collection and the importance of documenting what we have in museums. The talk that I want to give to you today follows on what Richard had discussed with you, but with a focus on one of the issues with which this museum was very closely involved during the last year, up until September 1st. Richard has spoken to you about the importance of the Pennsylvania Declaration in 1970, about the involvement of Froelich Rainey in the formulation of that declaration, and also about the role of the curators of the museum in discussing the problems associated with provenance and helping to formulate the declaration. I want to spend a little time on one of the issues that the museum faced in the late 1960s that played a role in pushing the curators and the director to formulate this Pennsylvania Declaration. And that involves a hoard of gold, allegedly from the area of Troy and possibly from the Mound of Troy itself, that was purchased by the museum in 1966. As you know, one of the defining features of the museum, in a sense its signature, is the fact that so much of what we have derives from our own excavations, our own research, so we can write the narratives associated with the material that we have on display because we've played a role in their discovery. But a few pieces, of course, have been bought from the art market, and this is one of them. Bought in 1966 from a dealer, a gallery, not very far from here, 2219 St. James Place, called Hesperia Arts. And you see the letter here that was written to David Crownover of the museum in 1966, offering these 24 objects for sale for $10,000. You see the objects here. All were of gold and electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver. So a series of earrings, bracelets, hair rings, diadems, and pendants, as well as necklaces, pins. Really a phenomenal collection, 24 objects, which all seem to be more or less of the same style and of the same workmanship. So they were purchased by the museum in 1966. We have documentation from Rodney Young, then curator-in-charge of the Mediterranean section, who liaised with Machteld Melink, the great archaeologist at Bryn Mawr. And they recommended purchase of the hoard in order to keep it together, because otherwise there was a fear that the pieces would be sold one after the other to different institutions or different collectors, and the assemblage would never be published qua assemblage, and they felt that it was a unified assemblage. The material that was bought, which often was called the Gold of Troy, even though the provenance was uncertain, was published immediately by George Bass, whom you see here, and who was also mentioned by Richard, who was curator in the Mediterranean section at that point, published in 1966, so immediately after it was acquired, in Expedition magazine, and then published a few years later in American Journal of Archaeology. So a popular publication, a scientific publication. This too is something, of course, that we're very proud of at the museum. With much of our field work, we've published it in a speedy fashion, or at least in a preliminary fashion, in some format so that people can be aware of the importance of the discovery. When Bass published this jewelry, he connected it from the point of view of style and workmanship with three different areas. The first was Troy, where I've had the good fortune to work for the last 25 years. You see it here on a map in what is now northwestern Turkey, an aerial view of the Mound of Troy, and a reconstruction of the second settlement of Troy, about 2400 BC, middle of the third millennium, in which Heinrich Schliemann, in 1873, had found a phenomenal treasure of gold, silver, and bronze, which he had christened the Treasure of Priam. You see it here on the head and shoulders of his wife, Sophia. You see it displayed as it is now in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, and several of the pieces that he found in this treasure. The treasure itself, the so-called Treasure of Priam, had a lot of similarities with the gold jewelry that was purchased by the Penn Museum in 1966. And you can see some of those similarities here in terms of the bracelets with the conical ends, and also in terms of the pins with the biconical urns at the top and the spiral filigree in the panels on the front. And I thank Jane Hickman for many of these images, both from Troy and also from Polyokny, which is the other site that George Bass named as a place where similar gold jewelry had been found, similar in style and workmanship. Troy, of course, is in the area of what is now Turkey. Polyokny, the other possible source, is on the island of Lemnos in what is now Greece. So you see the site of Polyokny, which is also a mid-3rd millennium BC site, so contemporary with Troy too, and some of the treasure that had been found at Polyokny. Here too you can see similarities between the kinds of bracelets that were found at Polyokny and the Troy treasure, with the so-called Gold of Troy in the Penn Museum, and the same with the basket earrings from Polyokny and what was purchased as part of the Penn hoard in 1966. The other area with which Bass drew a connection was southern Iraq, specifically the site of Ur, which of course was excavated by this museum in the 1920s. And if you look at some of these pendants with the quadruple conical spirals, you'll see the same sort of thing in a pendant from the royal tombs of Ur, much of which is exhibited, of course, upstairs on the 3rd floor. So George Bass said in these articles he couldn't be certain where it came from. Could have come from what is now Turkey, the area around Troy, could have come from what is now Greece, the area on or around Polyokny on the island of Lemnos. He thought it was less likely that it came from Ur, but he pointed out the strong similarities between the two of them. The Turkish Ministry of Culture was notified of this purchase by George Bass in 1966, and no concerns were raised about the issue of ownership. The gold in the Penn Museum, the so-called Gold of Troy in the Penn Museum, again received a great deal of publicity in the early 1990s when the Treasure of Priam was rediscovered in the basement of the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. As many of you know, the Treasure of Priam wound up in Berlin during World War II. It vanished mysteriously in 1945, and everyone thought that it had been melted down, which was a fate that befell so many ancient treasures in the face of armed conflict. But we later realized that the Soviet soldiers were under orders from the Kremlin. The Soviet soldiers who sacked the city of Berlin at the end of World War II were under orders from the Kremlin to take it back to Moscow and to put it secretly in the depots of the Pushkin Museum, which is where it was rediscovered in a sense. It was never lost. And Madame Irina Antonova, the director of the Pushkin Museum, then and now, was under instructions not to tell anyone of its whereabouts. But as one of the byproducts of the reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev in the early 1990s, its whereabouts were made known. And as this treasure, the Treasure of Priam, began to be published again with much greater detail than ever before, new light was cast on our treasure. And you see it on display here just a few years ago. Still, there was no concern expressed about ownership. And then in 2009, I've been working at Troy with Ernst Pernichko, one of the great ancient metallurgists in the world. And we've been working together, well, really for 2 decades. And I asked him if he would come and look at the Troy gold assemblage in the Penn Museum, because I wasn't sure that all of it was genuine. When you buy something from the art market, you can't be absolutely certain about its authenticity, because the forgers are so good these days. And I knew that he and his colleague Hermann Born from the Museum for Pre- and Proto-History in Berlin had just examined the gold the Treasure of Priam in Moscow. So I thought it was important that they look at ours. As they did, in February 2009, they pronounced it not only genuine, but of a single assemblage, so the metal content was the same in all of the examples. And then within one of the pieces, it was a pendant actually, that they examined, they found a grain of sand that contained an extraordinarily high level of arsenic, compatible with the extraordinarily high level of arsenic in the soil of Troy itself. One of the signatures of the earth on and around Troy is the extraordinarily high level of arsenic, literally everywhere, also in the water. And it was present in this sand as well. And the subsequent article in the Philadelphia Inquirer, written by Tom Averill, contained an interview with Ernst Perniczka, where he highlighted the fact that he had found this grain of sand, and that this would lead some to conclude that it was found in the general vicinity of Troy, although he said at the end of the article that he couldn't be sure that it was found in Troy or in the Troad, the area around Troy. It could have come from anywhere in the northeast Aegean, and he mentioned Turkey, Greece, and Bulgaria as possible, southeastern Bulgaria as possible candidates for the provenance. And then we got a visit in 2010 from the Vice Consul General of Turkey, from the Turkish consulate in New York. And I was very naive, I suppose, at that point when the vice consul called me and said, "I'd like to meet with you and the director." And that, of course, then that was Richard Hodges. And he said, "Is it all right if I bring a friend?" I said, "Of course. Bring anyone from the consulate you like." And then when we sat down in Richard Hodges' office, he said, "I suppose you're wondering why I've brought a lawyer with me." Well, no, I hadn't wondered at all. I knew then, but I hadn't known before. And he said, "We're interested in the Troy gold that you have in your collection, and we would be grateful if you would show us your dossier on the acquisition of the Troy gold." Now, you really can't do it that way. You have to go through the chief legal counsel of the university or of the museum in question. That would be Wendy White, who was one of the major figures involved in the subsequent discussions. But in collaboration with Wendy White, we released the primary documents we had concerning the acquisition of the gold in 1966. I really wasn't so concerned at this point because the museum had bought it in 1966. That's 4 years before the UNESCO convention. And so most of us in my generation had assumed that if a museum or a university, an institution, had purchased something before 1970, no country would go after it and claim it for repatriation. That is wrong. 1970 is, obviously, 1970 is no longer the line in the sand that we had assumed it to be for so many years, that I had assumed it to be since graduate school. It's now no longer respected. We subsequently entered into a series of discussions, and primarily Richard Hodges, I, and Wendy White, with me really as the intermediary between the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Wendy and Richard and Penn itself, as to what should happen with the gold. And Richard at one point had proposed to the ministry that it go to Turkey on long-term loan, 30 years. And this was rejected. And so we went back and forth with discussions of what could be acceptable to both sides. That's to say to Penn and to the Turkish Ministry of Culture. Meanwhile, at Penn, in the museum, we were getting concerned about the extent to which we had linked the treasure to Troy in our signage. Obviously, it couldn't have been more strongly linked to Troy. Now, you know, it doesn't take much of a brain to read the label here. And below it, you see Troy II, the second settlement of Troy, an aerial view of Troy, and then Sophia Schliemann wearing the treasure of Priam. Of course, we were trying to make it appealing to an audience. And again, when we put this together, when I suggested what to put there, I wasn't thinking that anyone would reclaim it because, again, it was 4 years earlier than UNESCO. But now we were engaged in extensive conversations with the Turkish Ministry of Culture. And as you see, midway through, we changed the label from the gold of Troy to Bronze Age gold. Now, this was an act of, some would say, desperation. All you needed to do was look below Bronze Age gold to find again Sophia Schliemann wearing the gold of the treasure of Priam. And then here is a map of Troy, here Troy and Ur, and then history of Troy, jewelry of Troy. But nevertheless, you see our reaction to that as these discussions continued, and they continued for about 10 months, really, from start to finish, 10 to 11 months. It was not something that happened overnight, and these were very difficult negotiations. It was certainly a test of my Turkish, although for the final negotiations, we both insisted on an interpreter because we were dealing with some very sensitive discussions. And in the end, we reached a compromise where the gold of Troy in the Penn Museum would travel to Turkey on indefinite loan. So it would be technically a loan. It wouldn't be a repatriation. And in return, our rights, our permissions to conduct research in Turkey, Penn's right to conduct research in Turkey, or ability to conduct research in Turkey, I should say, received a kind of blanket approval. Whatever we wanted to do would not be contested by anyone in the ministry. And we also struck a deal wherein the material found in the so-called Midas Mount, Tumulus MM at Gordian, would come to Penn for a year's exhibit. And that will happen in 2016, along with a phenomenal group of gold and silver, the so-called Lydian treasure, found in a series of Greco-Persian tombs dating to the late 6th, early 5th centuries BC, that had been bought actually by the Metropolitan Museum on the art market and subsequently repatriated to Turkey. That will come back, or will come to the States, to Penn, as part of this exhibit that we put together. And so on September 1st, the so-called gold of Troy in our museum traveled to Turkey. You see our keeper of the Mediterranean section, Lynn Mikowski, with Murat Suslu, the Director General of Antiquities of Turkey, and then you see the subsequent exhibit that opened at the Ankara Museum in, well, only a few days after this. So we are prominently mentioned in the headlines and in the main text panels, and complimented that we had, the bringing of these valuable artifacts in the land to which they belong has been achieved with the efforts of the Ministry of Culture and with well-intentioned manner of the University of Pennsylvania Museum. So you see the gold of Troy here. This is Minister of Culture Gunay, who has been one of the primary voices behind the claims for repatriation of ancient objects that reportedly have left Turkey illegally. I just wanted to, and so that was the best conclusion I think that we could have reached. We found a compromise that both sides could live with, which of course meant the president of the university and the board of trustees of the University of Pennsylvania, who have the final say on such issues. And we did it in such a way that our collaboration with Turkey could continue in the future. I just wanted to end with a few comments about the way in which antiquity and archaeology is increasingly playing a role in political discourse and in national identity. So particularly after the breakup of the Soviet Union, you saw countries, newly established countries, or re-established countries, trying to formulate their identities and going back to the ancient civilizations who lived in that area, whether there was any kinship connection or not, as a primary component in the construction of that identity. So on the 25,000 dinar note from Iraq, you see as the main item the sun god Shamash communicating divine wisdom to Hammurabi, who of course will write the first law code that we know of. If you were to go to Skopje in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, you would see that the airport was newly named Alexander the Great, and a giant statue of Alexander and his horse Bucephalus erected in downtown Skopje. And if you went to Armenia, you would see the 3rd millennium BC hero Haik gracing their currency. So moving to a time before competing religions began to occupy many of these areas. And you also see this happening with Troy. One of the arguments when Turkey wanted or had applied for membership in the European Union was that since Troy was in Turkey, and Troy lay at the foundation of the Iliad, which in turn lay at the foundation of the European cultural tradition, by extension, Turkey should be a member of the European Union. So Troy was being used as part of a political argument for political membership, political and economic membership. And you see this search for identity and new attitude toward the antiquities within that country receiving far more publicity than has been the case for a very long time, with the antiquities that are returned, and this is the Euphronius crater that Richard had shown you, being referred to in the catalogs as nostoi. Nostoi is a Greek word that was used to refer to the Greek heroes who had fought in the Trojan War and who had finally, after long journeys following that war, made it back home. So it's a reference to heroic homecomings with Homeric roots. And that's the way these things are thought of. On occasion, you've seen the citizens of a country, if the antiquities are a strong part of the national identity of that country, forming a ring around the museums that contain the most important objects of that culture, such as we saw in Cairo in 2011 during the riots, during the revolt as part of Arab Spring. Sometimes, of course, you see something very different, like the destruction of the Buddhas in Bamiyan. And you're increasingly seeing museums, new museums that are constructed with gaps that are left there in the anticipation that the antiquities that they have claimed from other countries ultimately will be repatriated and can fill those gaps. So you used to see similar kinds of things. The empty chairs in the early Christian mosaics of Ravenna, where you see the empty chair of Christ with the implication that eventually he will return to the earth and he will occupy his throne again. In a sense, it's the same sort of thing. And a new museum will be built at Troy, where they're going to do the same thing. Leave, as it were, empty thrones for the treasure of Priam, which of course is still in Moscow, but which Turkey is trying to get back. Very few museums are collecting in the wake of all of this increased nationalism in so many countries these days. And the only museum in America that I see still actively collecting from the art market is the Cleveland Museum. The bronze Apollo Soroktinos, it is by Praxiteles from the 4th century BC. Whether this is from the 4th century BC is a question mark, but it's a recent acquisition. This was bought last year. A very large marble portrait of Drusus the Younger, who's the son of the Emperor Tiberius. So bought only a year ago. It had allegedly been in a basement in Algeria for 100 years, which sounds suspicious, at least to me. And with these aggressive repatriation claims, museums are increasingly reluctant to buy anything from the art market. And as I say, Cleveland is really the only one still doing it. What has become clear is that, as I said, 1970 is no longer a line that countries are respecting. Turkey had claimed a Sphinx back that had been taken from Boğazköy in central Turkey, the capital of the Hittite Empire. And it had been taken to Germany in 1926. Turkey claimed it back a few years ago, just 2 years ago. Germany said, well, you gave it to us in 1926, and we're going to keep it. And Turkey said, well, prove it. And they said, well, those documents are in a building that was bombed during World War II, so we can't prove it. The document's burned. And so Turkey said, we want it back. As you see in the headline, this is Minister Günay, the Minister of Culture. And a month later, they gave it back. It returned to Turkey, where it was subsequently placed in the museum in Çorum, which is very close to where it originally would have been exhibited. And that's not the end of it. There are now claims for antiquities and works of art that were moved out of the country of origin to, or I should say looted from the country of origin, although the politics were very different then, and taken to another country at the beginning of the 20th century. So Turkey has claimed the statue of the old fisherman from Aphrodisias, acquired by the Pergamon Museum in 1905. So if countries are claiming antiquities from the beginning of the 20th century, it's not very long before they'll start claiming antiquities from the late 19th century and then going further. Now, if that happens, obviously we get into the campaigns of Napoleon and the Fourth Crusade in 1204, and the Trojan War itself. Borders have changed so radically, as have the controlling powers, that this will be a hornet's nest for everyone except the lawyers who will be trying to negotiate the competing claims that are circulating. I always end my talks these days with the quote that was written on a piece of cloth and hung above the Kabul Archaeological Museum in 2001 after the Taliban were thrown out of Afghanistan. A nation stays alive when its culture stays alive. And that's certainly true, but the meaning of those words is now more flexible, more fluid than it used to be. It's no longer as easy as it used to be to define culture, to define what it means for that culture to be alive, or even what it means to be a nation or a nation state. One thing is clear, that the new generation of archaeologists are graduate students. The next generation of archaeologists will have to spend as much time honing their diplomatic skills as they do learning the mechanics of archaeology. Thank you for listening to us. Thank you for your support of the museum.